For weeks, innocent people were being murdered at random until one discovery on a pair of mobile phones revealed a nightmare no one was prepared for.
Pretty scary.
Welcome to Pretty Scary, where each week I'll be slipping into the darker side of things, telling real stories from real people, talking horror films and true crime documentaries and anything pretty scary. But remember, I want to hear from you. Eerie, unexplainable, the moments that made your stomach drop, anything like that, send it in. You can email boo@prettyscary.com and follow along on socials at Pretty Scary Pod. And if you want the full experience, you can watch every episode over on YouTube. Just search for Pretty Scary. Okay, this episode comes with a disclaimer. This story that we're about to go into does include some very gory details, descriptions of violence and bodily harm. If you are squeamish, I do recommend choosing another episode of Pretty Scary to get your fix. There are many cases where investigators know exactly what or who they are looking for. A motive, a pattern, a connection between victims. And then there are cases like this one, where none of those things seem to exist. Imagine waking up to news of another random murder, then another, and then another. Different victims, different locations. No obvious reason why they were chosen. No witnesses, no clear suspect. Just a growing sense that someone, somewhere, is killing for reasons no one can understand. As the body count rose, an entire city began living in fear. People stopped walking alone, parents kept their children indoors, and police launched one of the biggest investigations the region had ever seen. They were desperate to stop whoever was responsible before they struck again. What they eventually uncovered would become one of the most disturbing criminal cases of the modern era. Not just because of the crimes themselves, but because of the chilling evidence left behind. This is the story of the Hammer Maniacs.
Pretty scary.
This case happened in Ukraine, so just before we go any further, I am going to do my absolute best to pronounce the names and places correctly, but forgive me if I butcher them. In Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine, in the summer of 2007, some of the most brutal murders ever took place. 3 18-year-old men were eventually arrested. Viktor Sayenko, Igor Soprunyuk, and Alexander Hanza. Only Viktor and Igor would be charged with murder, but their parents, one of whom was a defence lawyer, argued that these young men had been set up by the police. They had been coerced into confessing and they were innocent. However, amongst other evidence, it was when their mobile phones were recovered from their homes that there was absolutely no denying they were responsible. It made the case an open and shut one for the police and the courts, but the footage that was viewed that helped convict the men was something no one had ever seen before and would become one of the most famous leaked videos of all time. And it would be the very beginning of one of the most terrifying true crime stories that I have ever heard. June in Dnipropetrovsk, which is now known as Dnipro, thank God, is pleasantly warm, with long sunny days and warm nights. People often walk to and from work, enjoying the rivers in the early evenings, and lots of people use their bikes to make their commutes in these warmer months. But in 2007, best friends Viktor and Igor would take advantage of all of this and begin to terrorise the city. Let's go back for a moment though. Let me just tell you a little bit about these three men. Victor, Igor and Alexander had been friends for years. They went to school together and always hung out during summer holidays. Now, the boys had always been troublemakers. They had been in trouble before for vandalism and small crimes that were often put down to being young. In their later teens, though, the boys had begun to up the intensity of their crimes. They would often capture squirrels and small birds. This turned into capture and kill, which turned into capture, torture and kill. Now, we do see this in lots of cases of killers where their fascination begins at a fairly young age with death and often begins with killing of small animals. Victor and Igor were no different. Alexander, however, had an intense fear of blood and would often opt out of an evening with the other two when they told him their plans of killing animals. Now, it did start with small, wild animals, but eventually the boys would take pets from gardens, often dogs or cats, and they would do horrendous stuff to them. They would break their legs, they would cut them, slice their throats, they would often hang them from trees and leave them there. They also took lots of pictures beside the bodies of these animals that they had killed. So, back to June of 2007, when these boys are 18. Victor and Igor were about to do what we all expect them to do, when the animals weren't enough. They moved on to killing their first human victim. In the late evening of the 25th of June, a 33-year-old woman named Yekaterina Ilchenko was walking home from a friend's house. Igor and Victor later, in their confession to police, said that on this evening they were just out for a walk. But it just so happened that on that walk they had brought along a hammer, wrapped in a plastic bag that Igor had hidden in the waistband of his trousers. Yekaterina was walking one way and the two men were walking the other. They spotted her ahead of them and knew she would eventually have to pass by. And just as she did, she gave them a polite smile. Igor took the hammer from his waistband and hit Yekaterina across the side of the face. Hard. She fell to the ground instantly, and although she was unconscious, she was still breathing, and Igor and Victor just kept walking. One hit, no remorse, no worry, nothing. They just kept moving. Yekaterina lay there and slowly bled to death from the severe head trauma. And in a cruel twist of fate, Yekaterina's mother would be the one to discover her body at 5 a.m. the following morning when she was on her way to work. On this same night of the 25th, shortly after Igor and Victor attacked Yekaterina, they encountered a homeless man by the name of Roman Taterovich, who was asleep on a bench. Roman was found the next morning by passers-by, and his head had been so badly smashed that he was completely unrecognisable. 6 days later, on the 1st of July, 2 more people were brutally killed by Igor and Victor in the same manner, using blunt object to the head. 5 days after that, on the 6th of July, 3 more people were murdered in the town. The first was Igor Nichvolda, who was a recently discharged army recruit. He had been out with his friends that night and was walking home from a nightclub. He encountered Igor and Victor on a dimly lit street just outside his apartment building when the men bludgeoned him to death with what is believed to be the same hammer wrapped in a plastic bag that had been used before. They then threw the plastic bag away after killing Igor. Unbelievably, Igor Nichvolda was also discovered early the next morning by his own mother as she came to visit him. Now, still on the same night, there was a second victim, a 28-year-old woman named Yelena Schramm. She worked as a night guard and was walking to work, which was just around the corner from where Igor Nichvolda's body lay. Completely unaware of this, Yelena walked straight into the path of Viktor and Igor. She was carrying a bag of clothes with her, which she'd planned to change into after her shift. As she got closer to them, once again, Igor brought the now uncovered hammer out from his waistband, and he hit Yelena over the head. She fell to the ground, and the men took turns to hit her again and again. They then took the clothes from her bag, used them to clean the hammer, and took the empty bag with them to conceal the weapon. Later that same night, the men killed another woman named Valentina Hanza, who was in her 30s and a mother of 3. Right now in this story, we have covered 6 days, and these men have killed 7 people. The very next day, on the 7th day of this murder spree, the men attacked 2 14-year-old boys who were fishing in a nearby town. One of them managed to run away, but the other, unfortunately, was killed. 5 days after that, on the 12th of July, 48-year-old Sergei Yatsenko was riding his bike along a country road. Now, Sergei had recently been diagnosed with cancer and it left him unable to work. So instead, he took time to fix his cars and work on his bike, and he also did so for many of his friends and neighbours. On this particular day, he had left home to go and visit his grandson. Igor and Viktor were standing around this country road in the nearby woods with a hammer and what is believed to have been a pipe. As Sergei came to pass them, they pushed him off his bike, dragged him into the woods, and attacked him. Sergei's murder, like most of the murders committed by Viktor and Igor, was filmed. This video would be the only one of this case to be leaked, and it came to be known on the dark web as 3 Guys, 1 Hammer. Now, this video did the rounds in the 2000s, and anyone who saw it could not believe what they were seeing. Sergei was brutalised in ways that no horror film could even dream up. He was bludgeoned and cut open, his insides were pulled out, his eyes were gouged with a screwdriver, all this while still alive. On the film, Sergei can be heard making noises and gurgling on his own blood, while Igor and Viktor can be heard talking and laughing about how they can't believe he's still alive. When Sergei never made it to his grandson's house, his wife started to call friends and family, and after the whole day and night passed, she notified the police. Now, in Ukraine, the police won't act until 72 hours have passed, and so, in the meantime, Sergei's wife had started to put up posters of his face, asking people to let her know if he is seen. She was worried that he had had an accident on his bike or he had fallen ill somewhere due to his condition. But after a few days of searching, a local man, having seen one of the posters, contacted Sergei's wife to let her know that he had driven by an abandoned bike fitting the description on the poster. She spoke to this man and asked him if he would be willing to take her and some of her relatives there so that they could confirm if this was in fact her husband's bike or not. The man said yes, and he took them to the road by the woods, and there they did find Sergei's bike and his mutilated, decomposing body. Just days later, on the 14th of July, a 45-year-old woman met a very similar fate to Sergei as she was riding her scooter in a wooded area. The 2 men knocked her off, bludgeoned her with a hammer, and rode off on her scooter. Some locals were walking nearby that day and actually witnessed this, and they gave chase to the 2 men, but they didn't catch them. At this point, we are at 10 murder victims, and 13 more murders followed this. By this time, the police were obviously very aware of the killing spree happening in the town and the surrounding areas, because from the 14th to the 16th of July, 2 bodies were found every single day, all in the same bludgeoned, mutilated state. The police knew that they had a serious problem on their hands. In Ukraine, there had already been 2 notable serial killers who terrorised the streets. Anatoly Onoprienko, known as the Beast of Ukraine, had killed 52 people between 1989 and 1996. And Serhei Tkach, known as the Pologovsky Maniac, he killed 37 women and girls, although he claimed it was more like 100, and that was between 1980 and 2005. So this was bringing back memories of a much darker time for the local police authorities. The big difference, though, in the case of Igor and Viktor was that there seemed to be absolutely no MO, no pattern, no reason, no understanding of why they were doing this. There was no connection between any victims. They ranged from children to young men and women to older men and women. The first few murders committed by Igor and Viktor, the police actually never connected them because they seemed so random, which a lot of people condemned them for later, simply due to the fact that each victim was killed in the same way, blunt force to the head and face, usually leaving them unrecognisable. A little later, many victims were also tortured and mutilated. Now, there is one case of a woman who was killed by Viktor and Igor, but she has never formally been named. It was reported that the men killed her and cut her unborn fetus from her stomach, leaving both the mother and baby dead on the pavement not far from her home. The police, when they did eventually start to investigate these crimes as connected, began to realise that although there was clearly no motive, that some of the victims had belongings taken from them. Not all of them, but some. And mostly it was either their mobile phone or pieces of jewellery. Now, going back to the 14-year-old boys who were fishing, the one who managed to escape eventually sat down with the police to be interviewed about how his friend had died, and the police initially thought that he was the one who had killed him. But when the young boy described what had happened and gave a detailed description of the killers, the police had sketches made. It was at this point that the police started to connect the young 14-year-old boy's murder with the others and decided that they probably have serial killers on their hands. Now, because of the sheer amount of murders in such a short space of time, a special task force from Kiev was sent to Dnipro, and it was headed up by an accomplished criminal investigator named Vasily Paskalov. This manhunt soon grew, and almost every local law enforcement in the town and surrounding towns were working on this case. At its height, there were over 2,000 investigators trying to find the people responsible for this killing spree. Although the locals who lived in the towns where the attacks had taken place weren't officially warned by the law, many of them, having heard of these brutal murders, stayed home, especially at night. The breakthrough in this case came when the police distributed the sketches of the men that had been drawn up from the 14-year-old boy's description, and they handed them out to lots of pawn shops in the areas where the murders had occurred. The thinking behind this being that the things that were taken from victims would end up in pawn shops for money. And on the 23rd of July, Igor and Viktor took a mobile phone stolen from a victim into one of these pawn shops. The owner of the shop, having just had the sketches through days before and asked by the police to look out for these men, recognised them. He was so sure it was the guys the police were looking for that he had them wait around while he went into the back to check the phone was working. And there, he called the police, and in minutes, Igor and Viktor were arrested at the cash register of this pawn shop. Alexander Hanza, the other friend of Igor and Viktor, was later arrested at home where he had attempted to flush the victims' phones and jewellery down the toilet, but everything was recovered. When interviewed, the police learned that the 3 boys had gone to school together and been close friends for many years. At the age of 14, Victor and Igor admitted to each other that they both had a crippling fear of heights. And so they decided that in order to get rid of this fear, they would stand on the roof of their apartment building and hang over the edge. Now, for hours they did this. They would say that it worked. And as for Alexander, remember, his fear was blood, and he was said to be particularly squeamish. Even as youngsters, when Igor would get into fights, Alexander couldn't bear to watch. It made him physically sick. And so, using the same technique, Igor and Victor, in their heads, would try to cure Alexander of his fear, like they had done for their fear of heights. And this is when they would lure stray dogs into nearby woods. They would cut them open and they would try and make Alexander face the blood. Obviously, this didn't work. Alexander would feel ill every time they did it, and he tried to participate, but he couldn't. So not only did this cruel exercise not work in curing Alexander's blood phobia, but what we know now is that it was the starting point to some of the most brutal murders the world would ever hear of. The three men would go on to give full confessions of everything they had each done. Nothing contradicted their accounts. They gave details, times and dates that only the killers would know, and the police were certain they had the right guys. The three men were charged with involvement in 29 separate incidents, including 21 murders and 8 more attacks where victims survived. Igor was charged with 27 of the cases, including 21 counts of capital murder, 8 armed robberies, and 1 count of animal cruelty. Victor was charged with 25 instances, including 18 murders, 5 robberies, and 1 count of animal cruelty. Alexander was charged with 2 counts of armed robbery stemming from a March 1st, 2007 incident. So although all 3 men gave detailed confessions, Igor would later withdraw his, and so at the trial in 2008, he pleaded not guilty to all charges, while Alexander and Victor both pled guilty to theirs. Even though the prosecution could not actually come up with a motive for these murders, some local media outlets reported that the 2 men planned to make money from selling snuff films, which, if you don't know, is a genre of film that shows real killings. Along with blood-stained clothing, hammers, pipes, screwdrivers, the crowning evidence in this case was, of course, the footage. Filmed on multiple mobile phones, all stored in each of the 3 suspects' homes, over 300 photographs and videos were recovered. Many of these showed animal cruelty, the murders of victims, and pictures of Victor and Igor attending some of the victims' funerals. They would also visit the graves after the funerals had taken place, taking photos beside the site, laughing and showing the middle finger. The defence argued that these images and videos had been altered to show their clients when in fact they were never there. A film and video editing expert was brought in and testified that this was absolutely not true, and none of the photos or videos had been altered in any way, adding that, of course, it was possible for a photo to be fake, but a 40-minute video of a brutal murder would take a whole studio and months to make. So, thankfully, the court rejected all the defence's arguments, and it was ruled that there was enough evidence from the blood-soaked clothes, the many weapons, and the videos clearly showing the defendants in the act of murdering multiple people. This was all enough to end this trial and begin sentencing. So, on the 11th of February 2009, Viktor Sayenko and Igor Soprunyuk were both found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to life in prison. Igor was found guilty of 21 murders and Viktor of 18. They both also received an additional sentence of 15 years for robbery and animal cruelty. Alexander Hansa, who was not involved in the killings, was sentenced to 9 years for robbery. Alexander would later say that if he had known the true atrocities that his friends were committing, he would not have gone near them. The parents of Igor and Viktor maintained that their sons were innocent throughout the trial, throughout the sentencing, and afterwards. Igor's father gave multiple media and television interviews where he stated that his son and his friend had been set up by authorities and that the leniency of Alexander's sentence showed that he could be involved too. Now, this was obviously headline news in Ukraine for as long as the trial lasted. The more gory details emerged, the more people were hooked on this case. At one point after sentencing, the media ran a poll asking the public if they thought that the sentencing was fair or if there was foul play by the authorities. 50.3% of people thought that the sentence was fair, while 48.6% thought that the punishment should have been way more severe. And although the men's parents have tried to appeal, the Supreme Court of Ukraine upheld the life sentences for both Igor and Viktor. Alexander Hansa never appealed his sentence. He served his whole 9 years and was quietly released from prison in 2019. Now, I know this case was just crazy. It was one killing after another, but that is what I just found so unbelievable. I heard about this case years and years ago, and it's always been one that stuck with me. Just, no reasoning, just going out and committing these atrocious murders on random people. And I think also what makes this case even worse, if it can get worse, is that the parents of these boys set out on this media quest to try and make it seem like the police were corrupt. I mean, the video evidence, it literally shows these boys doing these absolutely horrendous things to innocent people. It's just a crazy case.
Pretty scary.